Hello, and welcome to this introductory video on creating a basic PowerPoint presentation that is accessible. We will cover several topics that will include choosing a design and layout, consideration of colors, contrast, and font size and style, as well as creating slide titles, adding alternative text to images and media, double-checking the reading order of content on each slide, and utilizing the built-in accessibility checker. Let us get started. The first step in creating an accessible PowerPoint presentation is choosing a design theme or template. The Design tab contains many built-in themes and color variants that can be used to change the look of a presentation, as well as the ability to create custom themes. Keep in mind that some of these templates have low contrast between text slide and slide background, and a few may also have busy backgrounds that can make text even more difficult to read. Be sure to choose a good theme with good contrast and with a simple background for a more accessible design. In addition to built-in and custom themes, there are thousands of templates available for download. You can search for a template by selecting File, New, and then describing the template in the search field. Add the word accessible to the search for templates that are tagged as accessible by the creator. While this doesn't guarantee accessibility, it increases the likelihood of finding a good template. Now that you've chosen a theme, let's move on to adding slides to our presentation. You can add a new slide from the Home or Insert tab. If you choose the new slide icon, PowerPoint will usually create a new slide with a title and content layout. You can also select the slide layout while creating the new slide. Select the small arrow right below the icon of New Slide, and a menu will drop down with all of the available slide layouts. Select one of these options to create a new slide with that particular layout. To change the layout of an existing slide, select the slide you would like to change. Go to Home, select Layout, and the layout options for the slide theme you've chosen will populate. Most slide layouts include a slide title, usually at the top of the slide. They also typically contain one or more placeholder areas where you can add content like lists, images, and tables to each slide. The title will be presented as a heading to screen readers and will be the first thing read on each slide. If each slide has a descriptive title, this will make it much easier for screen reader users to navigate the presentation. When using a pre-made slide layout and changing to a different pre-made slide layout, PowerPoint does its best to reapply already added content to where it should be, though some adjustments may need to be made. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to have 3 title and content slides, plus a title slide as the first slide. It is possible to make changes to content on all slides within a presentation, such as changing the text size and font. You can also make changes to specific slide layouts or even create new custom layouts. All of these changes are possible in the Slide Master view. This allows you to create accessible layouts that meet the needs of the presentation while maintaining a proper heading structure and reading order. To open Slide Master, select the View tab, then Slide Master. The different layouts that are available in the presentation will be displayed in the left-hand sidebar. The first slide in this sidebar is the master layout. Changes made to the master layout will usually be applied to every slide in the presentation. Below this master layout are different individual layouts. Changes made to one of these will be applied to every slide that uses this particular layout. For example, if we want to ensure that all font sizes stay above 18 and uses a sans serif font of Century Gothic, we can highlight the content for that slide and adjust accordingly. If I know that I might only use a title and title with content, I will only change those two slides on the master. But if something changes as I'm working and I decide to use a different layout aside from those two, such as a title with two content areas, I can always go back to this master slide and adjust the layout I need to reflect the font size and style I've chosen. To create a new slide layout, select Insert Layout, and then rename to give the new layout a descriptive name. You can then insert object placeholders such as content, text, and so forth, and change the size and position of the objects on the slide. Once all changes are complete, select Close Master View under Slide Master. Changes made within the Slide Master view will automatically be applied throughout the presentation where those specific layouts were used. Now it's time to start adding content to our slides. For the first title and content slide, or slide 2, we are going to add a picture so we can practice tagging with an alternative text. Alt text, or alternative text, is the text a screen reader will read aloud when it interacts with a graphic or table. Alt text is necessary so that individuals who are blind or are visually impaired can still access the information provided by an image and understand the image's purpose. You can add an image from your local computer or online through Creative Commons. For this demonstration, I will be adding an image from Creative Commons. Regardless of the method for adding an image, tagging the alt text is the same. Right-click on the image and select Edit Alt Text. A panel on the right will appear where you may add the alt text. A few guidelines to keep in mind. Be precise but also concise. It is generally recommended to use no more than 10 words to describe the picture. However, for some images, it may be more beneficial to use short phrases as long as it has relevant information and an appropriate definition or explanation of the picture. For the image I've added, an appropriate example might be a large passenger jet connected to a pushback tractor sitting on the runway. Additional things to keep in mind. There is no need to start a phrase with image of or picture of because the screen reader will automatically announce that it is an image. If the image does not serve a purpose in relation to the text and is only decorative, you may simply check the Mark as Decorative box. Finally, if the image was imported through Creative Commons, sometimes an alt text will be imported as well. You'll want to review it to make sure that it is adequate and follows good practices. Once your alt text is added, simply close out of the sidebar and all changes will be saved. In HTML, there are ways to identify row and column headers in a data table that make the contents of the table much more accessible to screen reader users. PowerPoint allows you to identify a single row of column headers and a single column of row headers. First, let's start by adding a table to our second title and content slide, or the third overall slide in our presentation. There are two ways to do this. One, simply click on the table icon in your content area and add the number of columns and rows that you need, and then click OK. Or you may go to Insert, Table, and hover over the squares to highlight the number of rows and columns you need in your table. For this particular demonstration, we need 3 columns and 4 rows. To identify the headers in a table, click inside the table so that the table design and layout options become visible. If the top row of the table contains headers for each column, as most tables do, make sure that the header row box is checked. If the first column of the table contains headers for each row, make sure the first column checkbox is also checked. For this demonstration, we will only check the header row. In the table design section, select a style where the table headers are clearly identified visually. From there, just start adding your content. For this demonstration, I will include a table to display song information. Each of the boxes in my header row will offer information for a song: artist, title, and genre. Then I can continue entering information accordingly. The easiest way to know your table contains content in the appropriate columns and rows is to use the tab on your keyboard. Each time you tab over, the subsequent information will be highlighted. This indicates it would be read aloud by a screen reader. You want to make sure that what is being highlighted would make sense for what is listed for that particular row and column. If a cell does not contain content, rather than leaving it blank, type empty, blank, or NA and select a font color to blend it into the background. That way it is invisible to the naked eye, but screen reader users will know it was intentionally left empty. Additionally, most screen readers will not identify table headers in PowerPoint, but we still recommend going through this process. It is important to identify headers visually, and support for table headers in Microsoft Office is constantly improving. Plus, these headers would be identified if saving the presentation to a PDF. Finally, always add alt text to the table to provide context. You can do this by clicking once on the table to show the resizing icons. Right-click on any one of these resizing icons and edit alt text. The same guidelines for alt text for images are also applied to tables and charts. We want to add a concise description of the information that the table contains. For our example, this might be popular songs by artist, title, and genre. Again, exit out and it will save automatically. Next, we're going to move on to descriptive URL links. Let's select our last slide in our presentation. Depending on your version of PowerPoint, it will automatically create a hyperlink when a user pastes a full URL onto a slide and presses Enter or space. Raw URLs may not make sense to screen reader users or others, so we want to make the link text descriptive. This just means that we're providing context to the link so one knows what they're clicking on. Let's practice. We've already added the webaim.org resources contrast checker. The second link we want to add is www.w3c.org/standards/. As you can see, my version of PowerPoint auto-generated a URL link. In order to make this descriptive, we want to right-click on the link, then select Edit Link. As you can see, the first web address for the WebAIM Color Contrast Checker resource is in the address box, but we need to change the text to display to make it descriptive. I'll highlight and delete this information out, and then simply call it WebAIM Color Contrast Checker. Then I can click OK, and then it will update accordingly. Let's do this for the second web address as well. Right-click, select Edit Link, and change the text to display to W3C Standards, and click OK. You can repeat this process for any other URLs that have been added to your presentation that are not descriptive. It is generally best practice to also include a text version of a link so any user opening the presentation can copy and paste the address if for some reason the descriptive link fails to open. I recommend putting this information in the notes section after any pertinent content so a user can opt for the screen reader to read it aloud or not and make it easier to jump over. You may be wondering why I didn't initially add titles to the slides, including our title slide, particularly why we were adding content. I did this intentionally to show you what happens when a title is left blank. First, let's go to Outline View by selecting View and Outline View. This generates a panel on the left to show the outline for each slide in the presentation. The outline version of a PowerPoint generally shows what a screen reader will read aloud when it encounters each slide. As you can see, some of the exceptions of what will not show on an outline view but would be read would include images with alt text as well as tables. However, each slide should have a title so a user knows what is to be encountered on the slide. As you can see, we have no titles, so I will go back in and add accordingly. Let's go back in to our normal view and add titles to each of our slides. Now, if we go back into our outline view, you'll see that our titles for each slide are now viewable. However, if you intentionally do not want a title on your slide, go ahead and add it, as we can make it invisible to the naked eye, but still allow it to be read by a screen reader later on. This brings us to slide reading order. Although it is best to use slides layouts when possible, there may be times when you need to add content to a slide when it would be impractical to create a new slide layout. By default, a screen reader will read the slide title first, followed by other content and elements defined in the slide layout. Then it will read any additional content on the slide in the order it was added to the slide. If you add content with this principle in mind, it should be presented to screen reader users in a logical order. You can check or change this reading order by selecting Home, Arrange, Selection pane. The selection pane will appear in the right-hand sidebar. The pane will show every object on the slide. Highlighting an object in the pane will also highlight the object on the slide itself. The reading order for the elements on the page is bottom to top. At first, this may seem illogical, but it helps to think of these objects as layers on the slide. The first object on the slide will be read first. Therefore, the title is at the bottom, so the title would be read first on this particular slide. If another object is added onto the top of the first object, then this object would be read next by a screen reader, and sometimes could potentially cover the first object visually. To reorder an item, simply click and drag. PowerPoint for Windows also has up-down arrows that can be used to reorder items. To the right of each item is an icon that looks like an eye. Clicking on this icon will hide the object visually in the slide, but would still be read by a screen reader. For example, if we wanted to not have a title on our third slide for tables, we could simply select the title and click the eye icon to make it invisible. However, it would still provide context to a screen reader. Since we are done with our PowerPoint presentation, we want to make sure that we're checking for additional accessibility considerations. PowerPoint includes a tool that will identify many common accessibility issues. This is the Accessibility Checker and is basically the same in both Windows and Mac, but the steps to start the check are different. To run the accessibility checker here in Windows, select File, Info, and then select Check for Issues and check Accessibility. In Mac, you would start it by selecting the Review tab and then just choose Check Accessibility. In Windows and Mac, the Accessibility Checker sidebar will appear to the right. The checker presents accessibility errors such as images with no alt text, warnings such as unclear link text, and tips such as checking the reading order, particularly for slides with custom content. Selecting an item in the report will highlight the issue within the slide. Information about the issue and instructions on how to repair it will appear on the bottom of the sidebar. While this is a warning and showing that it's hard to read text contrast, I've intentionally set it this way so that the font would read to a screen reader but remain invisible for those looking at the table visually. You can also see that we have a suggestion for the alternative text and that it was automatically generated by the Intelligent Services for Creative Commons and that we might want to double check it. We did this when we were adding the alt text to the image and it read just fine, so we can ignore it. When an issue is addressed, such as the alternative text, let's demonstrate what would happen if we changed the alt text to something we provided. As you can see, when we updated the alt text to something we provided versus the Intelligent Services, the warning disappeared. However, keep in mind that the accessibility checker is a good place to start, but certain elements, such as what the alt text actually reads as, text size, color as a secondary means to convey information, transitions, animations, captioned videos, and embedded audio for transcripts, as well as color contrast, are not checked by this tool and will be need to check for manually. So here's a few considerations. One of the inaccessible features frequently found in otherwise seemingly accessible themes has to do with the color contrast of the font for lower level headings such as URL links, as well as some of the table styles. So always double check for color contrast as you build content on the slide and adjust accordingly. One way to do this is through color hex codes and WebAIM's color contrast checker. To get the hex code of a color for a font, simply highlight anywhere in that particular font, select the drop-down arrow next to font color, and select more colors. Then choose the Custom tab, and you can see the color hex code here for black is #0000000. The hex code for white is always #FFFFF. However, sometimes our colors are a little different. For example, the background color here in our table is a shade of gray. In order to check the color of that, I can simply click anywhere in the background. I'll go to Table Design, click on Shading, and come down to More Fill Colors. Click the Custom tab if you're not there, and here again we have the hex code. I'm going to highlight this hex code and come over to WebAIM's color contrast checker at https://webaim.org/resources/contrast checker. I just pulled the hex code for my background color, so I will delete out the default and paste in the color for our background. Now our foreground color, which was the font, is defaulted as black. As you can see, we get a 12.94:1 contrast ratio. This indicates a high contrast. Typically, we aim for a contrast of anything at about 9:1 or higher, so no more action would need to be taken. However, if the contrast failed, you can scroll down and it will give you a more detailed indication of what passes and what fails for both normal text and large text, as well as graphical objects for both WCAG AA and AAA standards. Depending on the standards that you're required to follow, the ratio could pass one but not the other. If contrast fails, try choosing a darker or lighter font or background color to create more contrast between the two. As you can see, I can select the slide bar and adjust the contrast ratio accordingly. Once I find two colors of my liking that passes, I can copy the hex codes and paste the hex code into the hex code box. Then I can click OK, and it adjusted that box accordingly. A color to avoid would be orange, as it is neither considered to be a light color or a dark color. A color combination to avoid would be red and green. It is also recommended that if you're using red or green, make it darker so it is more legible. It is recommended that the text size is no smaller for 18 in PowerPoint and 24 if you're displaying the information on a large projection screen to an audience. However, this size may change depending on where you are presenting, who you are presenting to, and color contrast options you have selected. As you saw, some color contrast options may need to be bolded and larger in order to meet WCAG's AAA requirements. Color should always be used as a secondary means for conveying information. For example, if I want to color code the Rolling Stones as blue because it was the popular classic rock song, then I would need to do something aside just from coloring it blue in order to convey that information. I could choose to bold it, to italicize it. I could change the font size to a larger size, or I could even change the font type. What is not recommended is underlying information, as underlining is reserved for hyperlinks only. The last set of considerations relates to transitions, media, and displaying complex infographics. Transitions and animations are often used to accentuate the presentation of a PowerPoint. But if they're used, they should be simple and limited to essential functionality of information only, as specific animations, particularly those that come in very quickly or rotate more than 5 times in 3 seconds, can cause challenges for those who have been diagnosed with seizures, epilepsy, PTSD, and so forth. When displaying complex infographics, manually created flowcharts and graphics created directly in PowerPoint sometimes make it difficult to establish a correct reading order with so many layers on the slide. Therefore, it is recommended to take a screenshot and then import it as an image with appropriate alt text to describe the chart, rather than attempting to establish that correct reading order. If adding embedded videos, always check that videos are captioned to as close as to 100% accuracy as possible. And finally, provide a link for any embedded audio transcripts. I hope this video has clarified how to set up a basic PowerPoint presentation in Office 365 for accessibility. Thank you.